"Back away, sir, this is police business." The officer's voice cut through the flashing lights, sharp and dismissive. "Control your dog or leave now." "He's not just a dog," Ethan Cole said quietly. "Then prove it somewhere else," another officer muttered, not even looking at him. The red and blue lights painted the street in restless pulses, reflecting off rain-slick pavement and the silent faces of bystanders who had gathered but dared not step closer. Ethan stood still at the edge of the scene, his worn jacket clinging damply to his shoulders, his hand resting lightly on the leash of a German shepherd who wasn't pulling, wasn't barking, just watching with a focus that didn't belong to chaos, but to something older, something trained. Rex's ears twitched at the distant echo of a siren, low and fading, and his body stiffened in a way Ethan had learned not to ignore. Around them, the officers moved quickly but not calmly, voices overlapping, commands half-finished, the kind of tension that came when something had already gone wrong and no one wanted to be the one to say it out loud. Ethan shifted his weight but didn't step forward. He knew that look, the one people gave him, the assumption, the quiet dismissal, the belief that a man like him, a night shift security guard with a second-hand coat and a dog that didn't belong, had nothing to offer in a moment like this. He had seen it in grocery stores, in job interviews, in the way people avoided eye contact when his daughter asked too many hopeful questions. And yet Rex didn't care about any of that. Rex didn't understand judgment, or status, or the invisible lines people drew between who mattered and who didn't. He only understood signals, and right now, something in the air was calling to him. The dog's muscles tightened, not with fear but with recognition, as if the flashing lights and hurried footsteps were pieces of a language he had once spoken fluently. Ethan felt the leash go taut, just slightly, a silent request rather than a demand. "Easy," Ethan whispered, his voice low enough that only Rex could hear it, but the dog didn't relax. Instead, he leaned forward again, eyes locked on something beyond. The cluster of uniforms, something hidden from view but not from instinct. A stretcher sat empty near the back of an ambulance, its wheels locked, waiting, as if time itself had paused in that small, fragile space. One officer rubbed his forehead, another paced in tight circles, and somewhere in the distance, a radio crackled with words that sounded urgent but incomplete. Ethan swallowed, his gaze flickering from the officers to Rex, then back again. He knew what it meant when Rex looked like that. He had seen it once before, long ago, on a night that had changed everything, though no one else had noticed then either. "Sir," I said, "step back." The first officer snapped again, irritation rising now, edged with something like unease. Ethan nodded slowly, taking half a step back, not out of fear but out of understanding. Because sometimes, dignity didn't argue. It waited. And sometimes, the truth didn't arrive with noise, it arrived in silence, carried by the one voice no one thought to trust. Rex's gaze did not waver, not for a second, as if whatever lay beyond those uniforms was louder to him than the shouted commands and flashing lights combined. Ethan exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cool night air, his fingers tightening just slightly around the worn leather leash. "You feel that, do not you?" he murmured under his breath. The dog's ears flicked in response, his body leaning forward again, patient but insistent. "Sir, last warning," the officer said, stepping closer now, his tone no longer just dismissive but edged with control. "You are interfering with an active situation." "I am not interfering," Ethan replied calmly. "I am listening." The officer frowned, clearly not understanding, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Around them, the scene carried on in restless motion. A paramedic adjusted equipment near the ambulance, another checked something on a tablet, but no one was moving with certainty. It was the kind of hesitation that did not come from lack of training, but from something missing, something unseen. Ethan had learned to recognize that too. It was the same feeling he used to get when a security camera showed everything except the one angle that mattered, when the truth was present but just out of reach. Rex shifted again, a low sound forming in his throat, not a growl, not a bark, but something deeper, almost like a signal waiting to be understood. Ethan closed his eyes for half a second, just enough to quiet the noise around him. He remembered the first night he had found Rex, months ago, behind a chain-link fence on the edge of a shuttered training facility, the dog silent, alert, watching him with that same intensity. No tags, no owner, just a presence that did not belong to abandonment. You were never just a stray, Ethan whispered now, opening his eyes again. And you are not wrong now. The leash pulled once more, firmer this time, and Rex took a step forward. An officer immediately raised a hand. Stop. Do not let him any closer. He is trying to show you something, Ethan said, his voice still even, still steady. Dogs do not think like that, the officer shot back quickly. They react. That is all. Ethan nodded once, as if accepting the words, but his eyes stayed on Rex. Sometimes reacting is the truth before people catch up to it. For a brief moment, something shifted. Not in the officers, not in the flashing lights, but in the space between doubt and possibility. A paramedic glanced over, hesitating, as if considering whether there was more to this than it seemed. The night air felt heavier now, thicker, like it was holding its breath. Rex stepped again, slower this time, his nose lifting slightly as if tracing something invisible, his focus narrowing toward a point just beyond the parked patrol car. Ethan followed that line with his eyes, his heart tightening as realization began to form, quiet and undeniable. Whatever Rex was sensing, it was not random. It was precise. It was urgent. And it was being ignored. Ethan took one step forward, then another, not rushing, not challenging, just moving with a quiet certainty that did not need permission. Sir, the officer said again, but this time there was hesitation in his voice. Not authority. Uncertainty. Ethan did not stop. Because sometimes the difference between chaos and clarity was not more noise, but one person willing to trust what no one else could see. And somewhere beneath the flashing lights and the rising tension, a truth waited patiently, just beyond the reach of everyone except the one creature who had already found it. Rex moved before anyone gave permission, not in a sudden burst but in a controlled, deliberate stride that cut through the noise like a quiet decision already made. Hey, stop that dog, one officer called out, stepping forward, but there was hesitation in his movement, a fraction of doubt that slowed him just enough. He is not out of control, Ethan said, his voice calm but firm. He knows exactly where he is going. The officer reached for the leash, but Rex shifted just out of reach, not aggressive, not disobedient, simply focused, as if guided by something no one else could hear. Sir, you are crossing a line, another voice warned, sharper now. No, Ethan replied, taking another step, his eyes never leaving the path Rex was tracing. I am following one. The words hung in the air, strange and steady, and for a brief second, no one interrupted. The flashing lights continued to pulse, reflecting off the wet asphalt, but the energy had changed, pulled inward toward a single point of attention. Rex stopped near the far side of a patrol car, his nose lowering, then lifting again, scanning, recalibrating. He circled once, tight and precise, then paused, his body rigid, his gaze fixed on a narrow space between the vehicle and a low concrete barrier that most people would have overlooked without a second thought. There is nothing there, an officer muttered, more to himself than anyone else. But Rex did not move. He let out that same low, contained sound, not loud, not demanding, just certain. Ethan felt it in his chest, that quiet certainty that had no need for proof yet carried the weight of truth. Look again, Ethan said softly. Please. The word please landed differently than a command. It slowed things down. A paramedic stepped closer, crouching slightly, peering into the shadowed gap. I cannot see anything from this angle, he said, but he did not walk away. Instead, he shifted position, leaning further, adjusting his view. Hold on, he added. His tone changing, just slightly. Another officer joined him, kneeling this time, using a flashlight to cut through the dim space. The beam flickered across metal, pavement, then paused. Wait, the officer said, quieter now. There is someone here. The words moved through the group like a ripple, not loud, but undeniable. More lights angled in, more eyes focused, and suddenly the scattered urgency began to align. We need to get access from this side, the paramedic called out, his voice now steady with purpose. Careful, another officer added, already moving to reposition equipment. Ethan did not step closer. He did not speak again. He simply stood where he was, one hand resting lightly on Rex's back, feeling the slow, steady breath of the dog who had already done what no one else could. Rex relaxed just slightly, his posture easing, not because the situation was over, but because the message had been delivered. Around them, the scene shifted from confusion to coordination, from noise to intent. And for the first time since the lights had started flashing, the chaos gave way to something quieter, something clearer. Not because someone shouted louder, but because one silent signal had finally been understood. The flashlight beam steadied, no longer searching but confirming, and the moment stretched just long enough for everyone to feel it. "We have him," the paramedic said, his voice controlled but urgent. "He is conscious but weak. We need space and light." "Copy that," another officer responded quickly, already moving to clear the area. "Get the stretcher over here, now." The commands came sharper now, cleaner, like a system that had finally found its rhythm. Ethan remained still, his hand resting on Rex's shoulders, feeling the subtle shift in the dog's posture as tension gave way to quiet resolve. "Good work," Ethan whispered, not as praise, but as recognition. Rex did not look back. His eyes stayed forward, watching, as if making sure the job was truly in motion. The officers moved with purpose, repositioning the patrol car slightly, creating access where there had been none just moments ago. The stretcher rolled forward, its wheels clicking softly. Against the pavement, no longer idle, no longer waiting. "Easy now," the paramedic murmured as they carefully reached into the narrow space. "We have got you. Just stay with us." The words were calm, steady, the kind of reassurance that carried more than instruction. Around them, radios crackled with updates, but the tone had changed. Less confusion. More clarity. A line had been found, and now everyone was following it. One officer glanced toward Ethan, his expression no longer dismissive, but uncertain, as if trying to reconcile what he had just witnessed. "That dog," he said under his breath, almost to himself. Ethan met his gaze briefly, then looked back toward Rex. "He listens," Ethan replied simply. The officer nodded slowly, not fully understanding, but no longer arguing. The paramedics worked with quiet efficiency, adjusting positions, checking vitals, speaking in low, focused tones that blended into the hum of the night. The stretcher was locked into place, hand steady, movements precise. "We are moving," one of them called out. "On 3. They lifted carefully, guiding the officer out from the narrow gap, into the open space where light and attention could finally reach him fully. No one cheered. No one celebrated. They simply worked, each person doing exactly what was needed, nothing more, nothing less. Ethan watched from a distance, not stepping closer, not inserting himself into the process. He did not need to. The moment had already shifted. Rex finally relaxed, just a fraction, his ears lowering slightly, his body easing as the urgency began to fade. Ethan knelt beside him, his voice soft, almost lost in the sound of movement and radios. "You did what they could not see," he said. Rex blinked slowly, as if the words were not necessary, as if the truth had already been understood long before it was spoken. Across the scene, one of the officers who had spoken harshly earlier stood still for a moment, watching the stretcher being secured into the ambulance. His jaw tightened, not with anger, but with something heavier, something closer to realization. He glanced back at Ethan and Rex, then looked away again, as if unsure how to respond. The ambulance doors closed with a quiet, final click, and the engine started with a low, steady hum. The flashing lights remained, but they no longer felt chaotic. They felt purposeful. And in the space between noise and understanding, something unspoken settled over the scene. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just a quiet shift that everyone felt, even if no one said it out loud. The ambulance pulled away slowly, its lights still flashing but no longer frantic, just steady, controlled, like a heartbeat finding its rhythm again. The crowd began to thin, whispers replacing tension, footsteps retreating as the urgency dissolved into the quiet aftermath. "All units stand down," a voice came through the radio, firm but calm. Situation is stable. Stable. The word hung in the air, simple but heavy, carrying more meaning than anyone cared to say out loud. Ethan stood where he had been all along, just outside the center of it all, his presence unnoticed again now that the crisis had passed. That was how it usually went. Rex sat beside him, calm, composed, as if nothing extraordinary had happened, as if this was simply what he was meant to do. "You can go now," one officer said, walking over, his tone not unkind, but still distant, still unsure. Ethan nodded once. "We were already on our way," he replied quietly. The officer hesitated, glancing at Rex, then back at Ethan. "What your dog did," he started, then stopped, as if the sentence did not have a place to land. "He followed what mattered," Ethan said, not offering more, not needing to explain what could not be fully understood in words. The officer gave a small nod, but it was not agreement. It was acknowledgement. A subtle shift from dismissal to something closer to respect, even if he did not yet know how to carry it. Ethan reached down, unclipping the tension from the leash just enough to let it hang loose, a quiet signal between him and Rex that the moment had passed. "Come on," he said softly. Rex stood, falling into step beside him without hesitation, his movement smooth, unforced, like a partner who never needed direction twice. They walked away from the flashing lights, from the cluster of uniforms, from the scene that had already begun to fade into report writing and official language. Behind them, the officers regrouped, voices low, movement slower now, as if each of them was carrying a thought they had not expected to have. "Did you see that?" one of them asked under his breath. "Yeah," another replied. I do not know what to make of it." The first officer looked down at the ground, then back toward the direction Ethan had gone. "Maybe we are not supposed to make anything of it," he said quietly. "Maybe we are just supposed to remember it." Ethan did not hear those words. He did not need to. He had already returned to what mattered most. A small apartment 2 blocks away, a kitchen light that stayed on even when electricity was tight, and a little girl who would be waiting by the window, counting minutes instead of hours. The world behind him would move on, write its reports, file its conclusions, but Ethan knew something they did not. Not everything that mattered could be written down. Some things lived in moments. In choices. In silence. Rex glanced up at him once as they turned the corner, his eyes calm, steady, almost knowing. Ethan gave a faint smile, the kind that did not need to be seen to be real. "Yeah," he whispered. "I know." And as they disappeared into the dim glow of a streetlight, the night settled back into stillness, carrying with it a quiet truth that no one would say out loud, but no one would forget. The apartment was quiet in the way only small places could be, where every sound carried just a little further than it should. The faint hum of the refrigerator, the soft ticking of a wall clock that had long since lost its shine, and the gentle creak of old floorboards settling under the weight of time. Ethan pushed the door open slowly, careful not to let it slam, and before he could even step inside, a small voice broke through the silence. "Daddy!" Lily stood in the hallway, barefoot, her hair slightly messy from sleep, her eyes wide with that familiar mix of worry and hope. "I am here," Ethan said softly. She ran to him without hesitation, wrapping her arms around his waist, holding on just a second longer than usual. "You were late," she whispered. "I know," he replied, resting his hand gently on her head. Something came up. Rex stepped in behind him, his nails clicking lightly against the wooden floor, and Lily immediately dropped to her knees, hugging him next. "You too," she said, smiling now, her voice lighter. "Did you keep him safe?" Ethan watched them for a moment, the tension from the night settling into something quieter, something steadier. "He kept a lot of people safe," Ethan answered, his tone calm, almost distant, as if the words carried more weight than he wanted to show. Lily looked up at him, curious. "Like a hero?" she asked. Ethan paused, just for a second. Then he shook his head gently. "No," he said. "Like someone who knew what to do when it mattered." Lily seemed to think about that, her small brow furrowing slightly, then she nodded as if that made perfect sense. "That is better," she said simply. Ethan smiled faintly, not because it was funny, but because it was true. Later that night, after Lily had fallen asleep on the couch with a blanket half tucked around her, Ethan sat at the small kitchen table, a chipped mug of coffee cooling in his hands. Rex lay nearby, stretched out but alert, his eyes half open, always aware, always listening. The room was dim, lit only by a single lamp that cast long shadows across the walls. Ethan stared at the table, not really seeing it, his mind replaying the night in quiet fragments. The hesitation. The doubt. The moment everything shifted. He exhaled slowly, setting the mug down without taking a sip. "They still do not see it," he said quietly. Rex's ears twitched, but he did not move. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting toward the window, where the faint glow of streetlights painted soft patterns against the glass. "They see the uniform," he continued. "The badge. The rules." He paused, his voice lowering slightly. "But they forget what comes before all that." Rex lifted his head now, just slightly, as if listening more closely. Ethan nodded to himself, as if confirming something he had always known but rarely said out loud. Instinct. Trust. The part that does not wait for permission. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, steady, like a truth settling into place. Across the room, Lily shifted in her sleep, her hand resting loosely on the edge of the couch, her breathing soft and even. Ethan watched her for a moment, the weight in his chest easing just a little. "That is why you found him," he said, looking back at Rex. "And that is why they did not." Rex blinked slowly, his gaze calm, unwavering, as if the answer had never been a question to begin with. Outside, a distant siren echoed faintly through the night, but this time Rex did not react. He simply rested his head back down, his job done, his purpose fulfilled for now. And in that quiet room, far from flashing lights and unanswered questions, something deeper remained. Not recognition. Not reward. Just the quiet certainty that doing the right thing did not always change how the world saw you, but it changed what the world could no longer ignore. The next morning arrived quietly, without announcement, just a pale line of sunlight stretching across the kitchen floor and the soft clink of a spoon against a cereal bowl. Lily sat at the small table, swinging her feet gently, her eyes still half lost in sleep but her curiosity already awake. "Daddy," she said, looking up from her bowl, "do heroes ever get thanked?" Ethan paused by the counter, pouring coffee into the same chipped mug, the question settling into the room before he answered. "Sometimes," he said. "But not always." Lily tilted her head. "Is that okay?" Ethan glanced at Rex, who lay near the door, calm but alert as always. "It has to be," he replied. The apartment remained still for a moment, then a knock broke the quiet, firm but not aggressive, the kind of knock that carried purpose without urgency. Ethan frowned slightly, setting the mug down untouched. "Stay here," he said gently. Lily nodded, watching as he moved toward the door. Rex was already on his feet, not tense, just aware, his ears forward, his body steady. Ethan opened the door slowly, not expecting much, maybe a neighbor, maybe a delivery mistake. Instead, two uniformed officers stood outside, their posture straight, their expressions composed but not distant. The one on the left spoke first. "Mr. Ethan Cole." Ethan nodded once. "Yes." The officer glanced briefly at Rex, then back at Ethan. "We would like a moment of your time." There was no accusation in his voice, no edge, just something measured, something careful. Ethan stepped aside, opening the door wider. "Come in," he said. The officers entered, their presence filling the small space without overwhelming it. Lily watched from the table, her eyes wide now, her spoon forgotten. "Did something happen?" she asked quietly. The second officer looked at her, his expression softening just slightly. "Something did," he said. "But it is not what you think." Ethan closed the door behind them, the room suddenly feeling smaller, quieter, as if holding its breath again. "If this is about last night," Ethan began, his voice steady, "We did not interfere. We only followed what was already there." The first officer raised a hand gently, not to stop him, but to reassure him. "We know," he said. "That is why we are here." Ethan paused, the words not quite landing yet. The officer who was found, the second one, continued, "He is stable this morning. The doctors said the timing mattered. A lot." Lily's eyes lit up slightly, her voice soft but hopeful. "That means he is going to be okay." The officer nodded. "Yes. It looks that way." The room shifted, just slightly, the tension easing, but something else took its place. Something quieter, heavier. The first officer reached into his jacket, pulling out a small folder, worn at the edges, official but not new. He hesitated for just a second before speaking again. "There is something else you need to see," he said, placing the folder on the table. Ethan looked at it, then at Rex, then back again. "What is it?" he asked. The officer met his eyes, his tone calm, but different now, carrying a weight that had not been there before. "It is about your dog." Rex did not move. He simply watched, as if this moment had already happened somewhere long before anyone else realized it was coming. And in the quiet space of that small kitchen, between a father, a child, and two officers who no longer stood with doubt, the truth began to unfold, not with noise, not with force, but with the kind of clarity that only comes when something hidden is finally ready to be seen. The folder rested on the table like it had weight far beyond paper, its edges worn, its surface marked by time and handling, the kind of file that had been opened, closed, and set aside more than once. Ethan did not reach for it immediately. He looked at the officer, then at Rex, then finally down at the folder again. "Go ahead," the first officer said quietly. "You should see it." Ethan stepped closer, his movement slow, deliberate, as if he already sensed that whatever was inside would not just explain the past, but change how he understood it. He opened the folder carefully, the soft rustle of paper filling the silence. Inside were documents, identification photos, training logs, all neatly arranged, all official. His eye scanned the first page, then stopped. "K9 unit," he read under his breath, his voice barely above a whisper. Lily leaned forward from her chair, curious. "What does that mean?" she asked. Ethan did not answer right away. He turned another page, then another, each one revealing pieces that had never been spoken, never been known. "It means," the second officer said gently, "that your dog was trained for service." Ethan's gaze lifted slowly to Rex, who stood quietly across the room, unchanged, unaffected, as if none of this was new to him. "Search and rescue," the officer continued. "Advanced response. Situational detection." The words were precise, clinical, but they carried something deeper beneath them. He was not just trained, the first officer added. He was one of the best. The room fell still. Ethan looked back down at the file, his fingers resting lightly on the pages, as if grounding himself in something real. Then why was he alone, he asked, his voice calm, but with a question that had waited a long time. The officers exchanged a brief glance, not avoiding the answer, but measuring it. "The unit was disbanded," one of them said finally. "Budget cuts. Reassignments. Some dogs were relocated. Some," he paused, then finished quietly. "Some were lost in the process." Lily frowned slightly. "Lost," she repeated. Softly. The officer nodded once. "Not everyone gets a proper ending." Ethan closed the folder slowly, the sound final but not abrupt. He stood there for a moment, the pieces settling into place, the past and present aligning in a way that felt both heavy and clear. "He found his way," Ethan said at last, his voice steady, not emotional, just certain. Rex shifted slightly, stepping closer, his eyes meeting Ethan's, calm, unwavering, as if the truth did not change anything about who he was. "There is more," the first officer said, his tone careful. "Last night was not the first time something like this happened." Ethan looked up. "What do you mean?" The officer took a breath, then spoke with quiet precision. We checked records after the incident. There have been reports. Small ones. Unconfirmed at the time. Situations where outcomes changed unexpectedly. Situations near where you live. And now, we understand why. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of recognition. Not surprise, not shock, but something deeper. Something that had always been there, waiting to be named. Lily looked between them, then at Rex, her voice soft but certain. He has been helping people, she said. No one corrected her. No one needed to. The officer gave a small nod, his posture no longer rigid, no longer formal. Yes, he said. He has. Ethan rested his hand gently on Rex's back, not in ownership, not in control, but in quiet respect. He does not do it for recognition, Ethan said. The officer met his gaze. No, he replied. But that does not mean it goes unnoticed anymore. And in that small room, where nothing had changed and yet everything had shifted, the truth settled in fully. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just clear. The kind of clarity that does not demand attention, but earns it. The officers did not stay long after that. They did not need to. Some truths did not require long explanations, only the courage to acknowledge them. The folder remained on the table, quiet now, no longer a mystery but not something that needed to be revisited again and again. There will be a formal recognition, the first officer said before leaving, his tone respectful, measured. 4. The dog, and for you. Ethan shook his head slightly. He does not need that, he replied. The officer paused at the door, then gave a small nod. Maybe not, he said. But some people do. The door closed softly behind them, and the apartment returned to its familiar stillness. Lily looked at Rex, then at her father, her voice gentle but certain. He is still the same, right? Ethan smiled faintly, walking over and kneeling beside her. He was always the same, he said. We just understand him better now. Rex stood between them, calm, steady, as if nothing in his world had changed at all. Because for him, it had not. Later that afternoon, the street outside carried a different kind of quiet. Not the absence of noise, but the presence of attention. A patrol car slowed as it passed the building, not stopping, not signaling, just slowing enough to notice. Inside, Ethan sat by the window, a simple cup of coffee in his hands, watching without expectation. Rex lay nearby, his head resting on his paws, his breathing even, his presence grounding. Do you think they will come back? Lily asked from the couch, her voice softer now, thoughtful. Ethan looked out for a moment longer before answering. Maybe, he said. But not for the reasons they used to. Lily nodded, accepting that in the way only children could, without needing every detail. Evening came slowly, the sunlight fading into long shadows that stretched across the walls. The world outside continued as it always did, people moving, cars passing, lives unfolding without pause. But something had shifted, quietly, beneath the surface. Not in the way people spoke. Not in the way they acted. But in the way they saw. Across town, in a station filled with reports and routine, a group of officers stood around a table, the same folder open once more. No one laughed. No one dismissed it. They read in silence, each page turning with a kind of care that had not been there before. One officer leaned back, exhaling slowly. All this time, he said, his voice low. Another nodded. We were looking for answers in the wrong places. The room did not respond with words.